So I just have to say that all of these people seem completely oblivious to the fact that the grass is always greener on the other side. And I have first-hand experience that proves Canadians are not necessarily nicer to immigrants, and at times they can even be a lot worse than people from, let's say, other developed countries. And it just angers me so much seeing these people blindly fall for stereotypes that they don't have any grounds whatsoever to believe have even an ounce of truth in them. And especially to those people that went down in front of the Prime Minister begging for him to become the leader of their own country. I honestly hope that for their sake they were not being serious, because otherwise I think they need help and there's something severely wrong with them. No offense. But you would not want the Prime Minister of Canada to become the leader of your own country, firstly because he is a lot more socialist than any of the candidates in the current election, and besides that, he is allowing a lot more foreigners into the country who he doesn't even have the slightest clue how to begin assimilating, and I know this from first-hand experience. Like, why couldn't he focus on helping the people who are already here, who are in need of it? There are so many homeless Aboriginals in his own backyard. They're the most disadvantaged group in the whole entire country, more so than any of the refugees that he's allowing all the way across an ocean, most of whom don't even want to come here. Like, most of them did not even express any kind of interest in coming to Canada, because they would prefer to stay in countries that are closer to home, so that they'll have a much greater chance of being able to help the remaining people there rebuild their own country by the time the war ends. And I just find it ridiculous. He doesn't have the slightest clue. I don't think he has the slightest clue he doesn't have the best interests of the people of his country in mind. That's for sure. And I'm not saying that any of the candidates in the current election necessarily have the best interests of the people in America on their mind. But you have to understand that Canada has a reputation that it does not deserve. And I'm not saying that it applies to everywhere in the country, because I don't know, it could be different depending on where you live, I guess. But I'm familiar with the politics of Ontario specifically, and it's kind of the dominant part of the country, so I'm going to focus on that. And in my experience, it is the exact opposite of a utopia from that everyone seems to think. Like, let's say that the image of Canada does not live up to the reality of living here. And I'll use my own family as an example of that, because to give some background context, one of my parents is extremely educated. He has a PhD from the most prestigious university in Canada, and the other parent is just exactly the opposite way, unfortunately. So it was extremely coincidental. It was a bizarre coincidence how my parents ended up together, and how one of them went on to become extremely successful and educated while the other one just got worse and worse. But I don't think that necessarily should have been such a horrendous issue for us, that it would have prevented us from living in the first neighborhood that we first moved to in this country. Because the way that we were treated in the community that we first moved into was so bad that it actually forced us to leave that neighborhood for one that was quite a bit worse. Well, I would say that it wasn't necessarily worse. It was completely different, but not in a good way. And I was exposed to two extreme ends of this country from this experience of moving from one community that was way too conservative and then another one that was way too liberal on the other hand. And I don't want to get into a lot of details about this, because there are a lot of stories I can share in the future that once I've thought all of them through. Like, I've thought about so many things that have happened to me for the longest time, and that's all I ever do is, I think, I'm always thinking 24/7, and it just doesn't stop. Every single bad thing that I think has ever happened, I still remember it, and it's a horrible thing to have to live with. Like, nobody wants to remember every single bad experience that they've had, but that's just how my memory works. It is like a horrifying experience, I know, and I do want to overcome this really, this really traumatizing experience. But for now, I just want to say that I've, like, out of the close to 25 years that I've spent living in this country, I can count the number of, like, genuinely kind, caring, and empathetic people I've encountered on one hand. And 2 of them outside my family are the ones that I'm in regular contact with. And besides that, like, 99.9% of other people I've encountered were either just plain rude up front and patronizing, or they were disingenuous. They weren't actually kind or caring or empathetic in a genuine way. And you can easily tell that, I think, from the beginning. It's like a really fake kind of politeness that most people, if they aren't plain rude up front, that's how they are to you. Like, and I've just had so many negative experiences that now whenever I meet someone who says they're from Canada, like whenever I talk to someone online or wherever who's from Canada, I automatically have a bad impression of them. And I know it's not right, it's not fair to say that. All of my experiences, the potential positive experiences that I could have with other people have been tainted from all of the horrendous experiences. But it's just how it is now. I think that, first of all, one thing that a lot of people don't know about Canada is that a lot of people here are still forced to go to Catholic school when their parents don't even have any association with the Catholic Church. That was the case for myself. When I was a lot younger, I was forced to attend this small, publicly funded Catholic school in the community simply because it was the closest to our house, and also that particular school had trouble enrolling sufficient numbers of children at the time, and yet they still weren't sensitive to the fact that I was basically sent there by force, like I didn't have another choice, because they weren't accommodating of immigrants. And I think they were so stupid for not even realizing that the reason that they can't get sufficient numbers of children to enroll in their school is because the immigrants don't want to send their children there because of how they treat them. But anyway, that school, I found out, eventually got shut down permanently. It was in danger of being shut down even while I was attending there some 15 or 16 years ago. But it was so alienating. The community was so incredibly insular and so incredibly unaccommodating. Like, most of the children that I went to school with were born and raised in that city, in that neighborhood of Canada, and most of their parents were also born and raised in that same city or in that same community of Canada. And all of those parents acted like they belonged to a secret society that only individuals who fit an extremely specific set of criteria could get invited to. All of them were, for some bizarre reason, really protective of their homes, and they didn't want anybody who was, like, you know, remotely foreign or someone whose parents that they weren't familiar with to be invited into their homes. And they would act like, it's, the strangest thing to me thinking back on it now, but they acted like it was completely normal to behave this way, and that's how I thought that everyone else was like because of my experiences there. I thought it was normal to be a very strange and insular and antisocial person. So that's exactly how I became later on in life. And one of my parents even had a psychiatric assessment back in 1998 because of the way that she was treated due to being the only uneducated immigrant in our community. So she was alienated even by the other immigrants because they all had a much higher level of education than her. And even after that, they didn't do anything to help our family. They just left us alone, myself and my older sibling, at home with our parents. And they didn't do anything for our mom, and they didn't do anything for her children, which I find incredibly, strange and sad. It doesn't make sense. It's, so completely senseless to be so apathetic and detached towards people who are obviously it's your responsibility to help if you're a social worker or a community counselor or community servant. If you are some kind of public servant, then yes, you do have a moral obligation to help people who are in need of it when you're in a position to do so. Obviously, you can't help everyone, but if there's somebody who is in need of it, then I don't understand why you wouldn't try to help them. So after that, I think we were forced to move out of that community because nobody in that community wanted us there in the first place. From the beginning, they didn't want us living there among their people, and they got what they wanted when we ended up having to move out of there. And when we moved to a new neighborhood, it was located in a neighborhood that hadn't been built yet. So the houses were still being constructed, and we had to move into a very small building in the meantime, a communal building. And I don't even want to remember the details of this time because it was probably the worst and most distressing time for me. The school that was in this new neighborhood was on the opposite end of the spectrum from the other school that I attended, even though it was still a Catholic school. But it was an extremely ghetto one. I didn't understand why these kids had to behave in such a way that was so not normal for I don't know, so not normal for children, I guess, and especially not ones that are associated with the Catholic Church. So I guess that's kind of funny, but also it was when we moved to this neighborhood that I learned about another aspect of this country that really bothers me to this day, and that is the fact that the French language is given so much predominance that it affects everyone in the country regardless of where you're living. And even though most of the Francophone people living here can also have no problem speaking English, and a lot of them even prefer to speak English, people are still made to think that French is the most important, and they need it if they want to be able to get employed in Canada, if they want to have a future in Canada, and if they want to upgrade themselves. And if you want access to the best education and resources, then you'll end up having to take those courses in French, even though it doesn't make any sense why you would have to take science and mathematics and geography or, I don't know, any myriad of other subjects in French when it's obviously, not the case in other countries where you have to learn Spanish, for example, as a second language. You're not going to take physics or mathematics or computer science in Spanish, because there would be no point to that. There's no point to having to take these other classes in Spanish when they're not your first language. And that's not the case here. It seems to me like it's totally pointless, the division that is caused by language and religion and politics. Like, I just find that most people don't have the slightest clue about the reality of Canada, and this just provides a tiny little bit of insight into the reality that I think more people should be aware of. And I want to actually talk about other people, like the comments that I've personally found in the past and their own experiences, because I think it's also very important to include the feedback and comments that I've seen from other people, so that other people will know it's not just me who is feeling this way.